Good evening. The Syrian crisis is spilling over. The US has struck a Syrian airbase with 59 missiles. Western allies, along with Saudi Arabia, Australia, Israel and Turkey, support this attack. Russia, on the other hand, has vowed to help Syria strengthen its air defenses against future strikes. The Americans say their action was in retaliation for the Idlib gas attack. But why would Bashar al-Assad gas civilians when he was poised to win this war? And how has the West concluded that he was behind the attack? Could it be the ISIS or the Western-backed rebels? As the mystery deepens on Gravitas tonight, we bring you all sides of this story. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay, the top headlines this Friday. Just ahead of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's proposed India visit, the Canadian Legislative Assembly passes a resolution calling the 1984 riots a genocide. India calls the move misguided. Three people killed, others injured after a truck driver rams into people in Stockholm. The police haven't called it a terror attack. One person arrested. Russian President Vladimir Putin calls the US strikes an illegal act of aggression, suspends the deal to avoid mid-air clashes with American fighter jets over Syria. India and Bangladesh expected to sign at least two major defense deals. Prime Minister Modi breaks protocol to receive his Bangladeshi counterpart Sheikh Hasina without a security cordon in Delhi. Two days after the deadly chemical attack that left 86 people dead in Idlib, American missiles bombed a Syrian airbase. Trump's friend Russia has strongly condemned the attack. The battle lines have hardened with no clarity whatsoever on who was behind the gas attack that left 86 people dead and if it's being used as an excuse to intensify American aggression in the region. Here's a report. America has struck Syria. 59 Tomahawk missiles launched on the Al-Shairat airbase, fired from two American ships in the Mediterranean Sea. The Pentagon has released this video.
I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States.
The condemnation from Syria was swift and stern.
إن هذا العدوان الأمريكي المدان يؤكد استمرار الاستراتيجية الأمريكية الخاطئة ويقوض عملية مكافحة الإرهاب.
At least 6 people have been reported killed in the strikes. While American allies support the attack, Russia has vowed to help Syria strengthen defenses.
7 апреля Соединенные Штаты Америки нанесли удар по сирийским правительственным войскам, использовав в качестве предлога ситуацию химинцидентом в провинции Идлиб.
Washington insists the strike was in retaliation for the chemical attacks against civilians in Idlib. But how has the West established that the Assad regime was behind the attack? How does Assad benefit from a chemical attack at this point? He's secure. Washington has said it doesn't want to remove him. Did Assad use this window to carry out a chemical strike? Syria has confirmed striking Islamist bases using conventional bombs. And Russia says the strike hit an Islamist ammunition depot where chemicals were stored. The United Nations has already confirmed Syria's chemical weapons were destroyed in 2014. So who could have done this? As the mystery deepens, experts say the timing is crucial. America struck as Trump was hosting Xi Jinping. Was this a message on what could follow in North Korea? Bureau Report, WION. And joining us this evening on the show, we have James Dorsey. He is a senior fellow at the RSIS in Singapore. We have Gareth Brown joining us from Mosul. He's a journalist. Alexei Pushkov, who's joining us, I believe, a Middle East expert at the Russian International Affairs Council in Moscow. And we have Ahmed Awad, writer and political analyst, with me in the studio here. Good evening to all of you. Let me start with James Dorsey. How do you see the U.S. attack on the Syrian airbase, Mr. Dorsey?
Is several things. One is this is the first time that President Trump has actually responded to a humanitarian as well as an international issue. This comes days after he had stated that he was President of the United States, not President of the world. We'll have to see what this means, whether this was a one-off or whether this is a change of approach or strategy. Much will depend on how Syria itself responds, as well as how Russia responds. What is clear in any case is that this will give a lot kind of action and probably some degree of greater confidence in where the Trump administration may go among its other allies, for example, in Europe.
Gareth Brown, let me ask you this question then. Is the U.S. justified, was the U.S. justified rather in launching this attack, according to you?
I think absolutely the US was justified. For more than 6 years now, Bashar al-Assad has been slaughtering Syrian people. He's been acting with impunity. He's been able to completely ignore international law, international regulations, international norms. And this is not the first time that he's used chemical weapons. Back in 2013, he used chemical weapons to attack a Damascus suburb, and there was very nearly international action then. So I think a punitive strike, as this appears to have been, was absolutely justified.
How does the West know, Gareth, that it was the Assad regime which was behind this chemical attack and not someone else?
Well, we have a variety of sources, a variety of ways in which we can establish, who carried out the attack. The symptoms being displayed were consistent with nerve agents. We know that the regime had these particular nerve agents in its stockpile, and there was always skepticism back in 2013, 2014, when the regime said it was giving up these chemical weapons, that it actually had given up all of them. So we can compare soil samples, we can look, we can take eyewitness reports, we can look at how the chemical weapons were launched, and it's pretty conclusive that it was the regime. In fact, it's almost impossible that it could have been anyone else.
There's another expert I spoke to who said that these bombs are of the variety that are kitchen manufactured and not something that a professional Air Force would use. You were laughing, Mr. Awad, when he was answering.
Well, I think this is a reality. It is a story, assumptions based on a cooked up story to implement a case against the Syrian government and attacking, but it is not based on reality. So to speak of being an expert in chemical weapons and whether it was on the ground or used by the sky, I think should have been left to the international community and to the international investigation team to go and visit the place and find out who is the culprit behind, because this is a crime and we all condemn that crime, but that doesn't give the American legitimacy to attack Syrian position irrespective who is behind the bomb, because this is an act of aggression. This is a unilateral act without the UN charters on it, and we need to find out who has been carrying all this chemical attack on the Syrian people, which have been denied previously to entry into those part of the attack in Idlib. And we all know it is Idlib, which is run by al-Nusra, which is affiliated to Al-Qaeda. So if your source of information from those places for the United States is from Al-Qaeda, then the question mark comes whether Hillary Clinton herself has siphoned those chemicals to the hand of the terrorists from Libya, as it has been addressed earlier by many of the experts, or whether it has come from Turkey, where the Syrian government have already warned the international community, have already informed the OPCW that there were, and the UN agency, that there were chemicals smuggled into that part of Syria and Idlib, and they are stockpiling it. So at the end of the day, the investigation was not carried out. This preemptive kind of a strike has already emptied the investigation into the really to find the culprit behind it.
Gareth Brown, I'm told you want to come in.
Yeah, it wasn't a preemptive strike. More than 100 people are dead. Dr. Weil.
It was not
more
planned.
Than 20 children.
It was not planned at all. The attack, was
children
not
suffocated to death in the most horrible, painful death that you can't even imagine. There was nothing preemptive about this strike. It was entirely reactionary.
Reactionary, Gareth, as an expert, you call yourself an expert. I don't think, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
To completely ignore murder of more than 100 people.
Absolutely, it was awful. It was absolutely awful what happened in Idlib. But the question is, who was behind it?
So the attack, that's what I'm saying. Attacking a target in Syria will not take a plan of 2 days of retaliation. It's not somebody sitting in California watching the TV and press the button and say attack here. The attack has been planned for a long time. It has not. It's just been executed now to prove to the United States that Donald Trump is different from what the other administration have been doing. I think.
But how is this different? Because Donald Trump, interestingly, had been telling Barack Obama, don't attack Syria, don't attack. He has to have a very good reason to do so himself.
If you have watching the CNN and the BBC and Al Jazeera, all these smear campaign against these chemicals, and they make you feel that there is something inhuman has been happened. All of us had that pain, all of us, but we do not build up a nation on emotion.
What happened in Idlib was inhuman. Somebody had the chemical weapons, we don't know who.
How I am with you to fight to find out who is behind it. But who gave the American, the dog police of the world, that the global police you go and attack without the UN Security Council resolution?
There was no independent inquiry, Gareth. There was no independent. Within 2 days, it seems, the American government decided that it was the Assad regime. Last week, they were saying we want Assad to stay. It's not priority number one to see him go. Within a week, they decide he is behind a chemical attack, and they go and bomb an Air Force base.
Well, again, it's not them just making up their mind on a whim. It's looking at the evidence that we do have. A reporter from The Guardian managed to access the site, largely rubbished these Russian claims as to what happened. 2 AFP reporters visited the site the day of the attack. We know US and coalition NATO military assets monitor Syria anyway. It's a war zone. You know, it's bound to be monitored. So actually, on the weight of evidence, you know, I think it's slightly disingenuous to just say there wasn't an investigation because there was a huge bank, already a huge bank of evidence, which points to the Syrian regime having carried out this massacre on its own.
Okay. Alexei, the Russian government has called it an act of illegal aggression. Why?
So basically because, as previous speakers mentioned, that the attack was launched without UN Security Council resolution and without invitation of the host party, so without the consent of the Syrian government. So this is the major things, because in this case, the US violated country's sovereignty. But if I may jump into the discussion about the investigation, I mean, it reminds me of a quite similar situation in 2013 when there was also a chemical attack in Ghouta area near Damascus. So basically, after the UN investigative committee released the report had no confirmation and no evidence that the attack was conducted by the government. Oppositely, the commissioner, Carla Del Ponte, she pointed out that more evidences show that the opposition used the chemical weapons. So without any investigation currently, only 3 days after the chemical attack, it's quite premature to draw any conclusions. So current conclusions, they have no hard evidences, no solid proofs. So we need to wait for the investigation. And I won't wonder if the report will again claim that there is not the regime who was behind the attack, because numerous reports already confirmed that opposition rebels already they do possess chemical weapons.
Right. Gareth Brown, I'm told that you want to make a point, and I also want to add to what happened in September 2013. Analyst Noam Chomsky said at a lecture that the US had similarly produced an astoundingly accurate death toll after each clash with the Viet Cong. It seems that the US administration is very quick to assess the damage and to find out who's behind an attack like this in Syria every time it happens?
I'm not sure about that, but just to comment on Alexei's point about the investigation into the attack in 2013, that UN investigation, it did not have a mandate to attribute blame. And that was because the Russians said that this investigation could go ahead and you can determine whether or not chemical weapons were used, but it cannot attribute blame. So that was the reason that the UN weren't able to officially point fingers at the Assad regime. And it's already been said by Russian officials that the same would be done. They might open the doors and allow some investigators in after a few weeks or whatever. But again, Russia are going to block any attempt at an investigation which will attribute blame, because it will show undoubtedly that the Assad regime was responsible. So for him to say what he just said is quite disingenuous, and I think he's misleading people when he tries to make the point that, oh, well, they didn't find the Russians or the Assad regime were responsible, because that was part of the Russians doing by designing the mandate for the investigation the way they did.
Alexei, do you want to respond?
Comes up, then who is responsible and who has the right to attribute the blame, if not the UN commission, investigative commission, which gathers all evidences and on the ground?
Theory, but you know, Russia just bullies the rest of the United Nations Security Council and allows and dictates to it what it should be. So I mean, we can expect the same thing to happen with any investigation into this.
Well, we don't know who's the bully, and it's obviously one country's word against another.
But I'm telling you, that's what happened.
Your version of events against the other sides, but
that's not a version of events. That's what happened in 2013.
So we're going to wait for an independent inquiry into what really happened in Idlib. In the meantime, I want to ask this to James Dorsey: how does Bashar al-Assad stand to gain by gassing his own people at a time when he was already winning the war, some say, against the ISIS?
I think there's several factors. One is, I believe that this was in part, not exclusively, but in part, designed to test the Trump administration to see how far they could go. And the message is very clear. Independent of that, whatever the outcome of the Syrian war will be, whatever happens when the weapons fall silent, Syria, as the nation state that we knew it, no longer will exist. Assad will be president of a part of Syria, and Assad is damaged goods. Even if he survives, he would be a pariah. So those people who are living in Idlib are not, that's basically an opposition-controlled, a rebel-controlled area, which may very likely not be part of the area that Assad will one day control. So in that sense, those people are expendable.
WION Awad, does it make sense to you that he was trying to flex his muscle and see where he stands?
I don't think there is a flexing it. We are not here to show our power. We are a small country, and we're a pawns in the backgammon game. And, you know, we are in the chess game. We are not. It is thus the geopolitics of the game and the proxy
But he
war.
wants to establish his authority.
For what? If there's Tulsi Gabbard, like she was in Syria, she was given hard evidence of the CIA involvement in supporting the terrorist organization on the ground, given to Trump himself, changed his position on Syria, ready to fight ISIS as a priority. French foreign minister echoed the same. The Turkish said, we finished our operation, now we are going to do it. All this and the reconciliation was taking place in Homs and in Hama and also in Ghouta. And then we have on the Astana talk was on. Then we had Geneva talk on. Why I should flex your muscle at the stage where I am gaining on the ground? Look at the attack on Deir ez-Zor, which happened earlier by the US forces on Syrian troops. They killed 86 soldiers. The second, immediately after the attack, they said, oh, by mistake, we attacked the Syrian position, which is known to them for 5 years that they were the Syrian position there. Who moved in immediately? It was the IS who came and controlled the area where the Syrian regime was attacked. Similar things happening now. The airfield, which they have dismantled now, is the airfield which has used the anti-aircraft missile against Israel incursion to Syria, which has been denied. In fact, it is according to reports which we have, that it is Netanyahu who has given the American administration the spot on those data to attack this, because it's a retaliation, because we know and the rest of the world know The air force and the airspace in Syria is controlled by Russia. So therefore, when you are doing a revenge attack for something that Syria was defending its own, it's a clear indication that you don't care about the human value or a collateral damage you have caused. They have killed 416 people in Mosul where Gareth is sitting. They have killed more than 200 in Raqqa and in Deir ez-Zor. Nothing has happened, nothing. The world says, sorry, it's a collateral damage. When it comes to something like this, it is only inhuman. It's the Syrian government, is a dictator, is an authoritarian regime. He's doing this job to his own people. Why can't we have blueprint on those issues to find out who is killing the innocent people in Syria, who raised the false flag in Iraq? It was Colin Powell who were in the UN and he was showing the world that these are the chemical, these are how they are siphoning it. And after 4 or 5 years, he said, I'm sorry, I lied to the world. And then we see Tony Blair, after 13 years, he said, I'm sorry, I lied to my people. I have to wait for 13 years to come again to your channel and say to the world that these people were lying? I am not going to buy their argument, whether it is in Libya, whether it is in Syria, whether it's in Iraq. I need an independent body. I want this war in my country to finish. And finishing this war, we will continue to fight terrorists on the ground, and this will not deter the Syrian government from continuing its forces on the ground. And trust me on this, the Russians are more adamant at this stage to make sure that the Syrian will win after this war. There is no question that Syria will be divided. If we start talking on the sectarian line on dividing Syria, I think that is the ultimatum game of the regime change which they have started, the NATO and the United States.
Dr. Awad, the problem here is that no side has a clean slate, no side has a clean record, which is what makes it so mysterious. You do not know who to trust in this game. But Gareth Brown, I want to come to you with the same question. Does it make sense for Assad to launch a chemical attack at a time when the US was saying it's not priority number one to let him go, when it was being called a win for Russia and Iran that the United States might let Assad stay in power because their focus is on ISIS? Why would he do something like this at this point in time?
Well, I mean, it's not a case of this suddenly happening. Actually, the Assad regime has conducted chemical attacks on a fairly regular basis, and they've been well documented in regime areas. But yeah, they do have to gain. You know, this is a totalitarian state we're talking about here. There was a book came out about Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the 90s called Republic of Fear, and it's very similar to what's going on in Syria. You know, the only way Assad can really survive is if he has complete submission of the people living within his country. So this was
an attempt, I'm sorry to interrupt, to establish that he was the unchallenged ruler of Syria, even if you call it a totalitarian regime. They do not gas people at whim.
It's an ongoing attempt. It's part of his ploy. You know, this is a dictator who, I mean, let's put the chemical weapons aside for a minute. Let's just talk about the barrel bombings over Aleppo. He has massacred thousands and thousands of civilians. He's not a rational actor.
So have the US forces in Mosul.
Rational.
So have the US forces in Mosul.
I resent that. I resent that hugely. I've reported significantly on civilian casualties in Mosul caused by coalition airstrikes. Not just the US, but European coalition airstrikes. I've spent hours, days reporting on that and holding the US government to account. There's a clear difference between targeting schools and hospitals and people dying in airstrikes. You used the term collateral damage. They're clearly not the intended targets. It's still a tragedy. People still need to be held to account. But this equivalency between Assad butchering Syrians and collateral damage in Mosul is ridiculous.
Okay, so you say there was a strike on a mosque which had displaced people. I think 70-odd people died, and the US forces said that was not the intended target. But be that as it may, that's a debate for another day. I want to take this question to Alexei. Do you see the logic, Alexei, for Bashar al-Assad to launch a strike at this point? How do you respond to these arguments that he was trying to essablish his authority and this was the best time for him to do so?
I don't buy this argument. Firstly, as Golub was already mentioned, that just days before the U.S. administration defined its approach to Syria and said that replacing Assad is no more #1 priority for Washington. So it would be very unwise for Assad, you know, to test the waters and to test his fate, you know, after the United States finally changed its overall approach in Syria. So I don't think that was rational behind the attack, if it was if Assad was behind it.
Right, I'm going to request you all to stay. As we've been saying, Syria has seen chemical attacks before. In 2013, we mentioned the West was quick to pin blame on Assad, and experts picked many holes in the United Nations investigation report that followed. So let's take a look at, closer look rather, at the weapon stockpile, the chemical weapon stockpile in Syria. The United Nations said that it had dismantled the chemical weapons in Syria back in 2014. 65 chemical strikes have been reported since 2012. 7 of these attacks in rebel-held areas. So there is certainly a record. But the question here is this, Gareth Brown. The UN concluded in 2014 that Syria no longer has chemical weapons. Was that UN report wrong? Has Syria developed more weapons since 2014? Or is the assessment wrong that the Syrian regime could be behind what happened in Idlib?
So that assessment that the Syrian regime had given up all its chemical weapons, we're particularly talking about sarin gas here. It was a very nasty nerve agent. Actually, the Syrian regime's kind of recipe, if you like, for sarin gas contained a chemical called hexamine, which is very, very rare to have in sarin gas, which was why it was so easy to link it to the attacks in Ghouta. Sorry, to go back to my initial point, though, that initial report put a lot of faith in the Russians, and it put a lot of faith in the Syrian regime. Because the country was so closed, the UN reporters couldn't actually go where they wanted to. They constantly had a government minder with them. They were taken only to sites that the Syrian regime wanted them to see. So we put, for that report, a lot of faith was put in these two regimes. So is it any surprise that perhaps they've lied, they've hidden, they've kept some of the substances? It shouldn't be a surprise at all. Why would we trust these regimes why would we take their word for it when we've seen what they're doing regarding human rights in Syria and elsewhere?
Well, that question applies to everyone. And let me quote from a report, Dr. Awad, before I come to you. This is after the 2016 attack. The UN Chemical Weapons Report on Syria was released in August 30, 2016. It says the only actual findings in the report were that Islamic State had used sulfur mustard gas, yet ISIS and Syrian State were put in the same basket by America and its allies. The UN report makes no mention whatsoever of testimonies of chlorine attacks by anti-Assad rebels backed by the West. It seems that chemical weapon stockpiles are available for each side.
It is available for the terrorists because the UN has given the clear chit. I don't know from where we get our information. Of the UN agency themselves have stated that Syrian regime have dismantled and they have taken 1,600 tons and they have destroyed it.
But why should they be trusted, as Gareth Brown says?
Well, they have to be trusted. Then whom you wanted to trust? You want to trust Al-Qaeda, or you want to trust IS, or wanted the Jaish al-Islam or Jaish al-Fatah? Who? 1,250 groups on the ground, which they have already come from Libya. We have 150,000 mercenaries come from all over the world. United States very well known about this who are in there and who has actually built up for Saddam Hussein his chemical weapon. Was Saddam Hussein who built it for the United States themselves? They built it for him in the 70s and they allowed him to use the gas. They know where the gas is stored. It was a deterrence. That is the poor man deterrence, the poor country deterrence against any aggression. That's why when Israel was having the nuclear weapon, Syrian had this one, and then American wanted to make sure that there is no threat to Israel at all. So they removed it, and Israel gave the clean sheet. Even Lieberman himself was saying this himself, and he was disappointed with his own statement because he knows that the Syrian government did not have the chemical weapon anymore. Right. So once you dismantle the chemical weapon of Syria, now you are disintegrating Syria. Now you are implementing the Syrian government and attacking on Syrians. Can you tell me why the government of Syria has to choose Idlib when they can attack in somewhere neighboring if they use the chemical, where they can hide the fact and the evidence against, while in Idlib it's under the control of Al-Qaeda, should attack there and let the whole world see that it is the culprit is the Syrian government? I think this is insane. And to see, I'm not an expert on chemical. I'm not in touch with any of the MI5 or the CIA to give you the inside information, but I am sure that we are paying a price for somebody and someone is making us us pay this price because we wanted to give a lie that these are Syrian government carried out the job. It never been carried out. Syrian government, what is the gaining of a Syrian government to use against us? I am from Hama. Right. A city of my country in 1980 was bombed by the Syrian government because the Muslim Brotherhood were there. Yes, I lost a member of my family during that time. I know the pain we had on these issues. But nerve gas, chemical, never been used in Syria by the Syrian regime. This is an acquisition which nobody can buy, and nobody can buy this argument.
Gareth Brown, you say that why should we trust the Syrian regime? That's a very flimsy argument. I mean, if the West, by you I mean the West, the Western governments, the coalition, did not trust the Syrian government, then they should have investigated this before. And how do you respond to what Dr. Awad says? Who would you trust if not the UN?
Okay. Well, I mean, they did try, and they've tried many times to solve this through the UN Security Council, but it's such an outdated apparatus that its format just allows Russia to veto anything that might bring the Syrian regime to account. So, I mean, the UNSC is failing as an institution, but anytime there's an attempt to act unilaterally without a UNSC resolution, which is never going to happen, it's never going to be granted because of the Russian veto. It's an act of, it's infringing on sovereignty. It's impossible. It's a catch-22 for any Western government that wants to see any sort of justice in Syria. They can't do anything through the United Nations, and if they attempt to do things around the United Nations, even with international consensus, we're seeing now significant international consensus regarding Trump's strikes. The only countries that have come out against it are Russia and Iran. Surprise, surprise. People close to the regime, people who are shilling for the regime will declare or shilling for Russia will declare it a violation of sovereignty. So it's an impossible situation.
Okay.
Thanks.
Stephen Golub, security expert, is also joining us from Serbia. Stephen, good evening and welcome to the show. We're talking about how the West concluded so quickly that it was Assad behind the Idlib gas attack, and what follows from there on. How does it help Bashar al-Assad to launch an attack like this on his own people?
Well, what I would add to the very healthy, useful debate you've had so far is to answer part of your question. It helps to show them that he's capable of anything, that he can intimidate them in any way he wants, up to and including his people and his opponents in the country. That's one mechanism at his disposal. I'll add just one other consideration here, in that he may have had an indirect signal that he interpreted correctly or perhaps incorrectly from the U.S. government in terms of statements from our UN ambassador and our Secretary of State indicating that U.S. was stepping back, taking a relatively hands-off approach to Syria from now on just a week ago. And he may have misinterpreted our Secretary of State saying that it was up to the Syrian people somehow to decide to remove Assad. He might have misinterpreted that to then go on to say, okay, I can now do anything up to and including chemical weapons. Now, having said all that, the one thing I'll add is that we are so early in this process of finding out what went on, exactly where we are in ascertaining the roots of this chemical attack, that I think it's great that we're having this debate, but in the days and weeks and perhaps months to come, a lot of the questions we're grappling now will become clearer.
So would you say that the attack on the Syrian airbase then was premature and or on the other hand was planned way too quickly when the world was still coming to terms with what happened in Idlib?
Well, based on what we know now, and again, I want to emphasize what we know now is very limited, I'd say no, it was not premature. If in fact this was an attack by Assad, it was fine to strike back at him quickly. What I would not dismiss from this calculation is whether to some extent Donald Trump was reacting instinctively rather than strategically, and whether there might have been what we call in the U.S. a wag the dog phenomenon. That is, that even though this attack might have been substantively legitimate according to foreign policy and human rights, humanitarian considerations, whether part of the calculation on the part of Trump and his advisors, well, this distracts the U.S. public from all the controversies and scandals swirling around him. I'm not asserting that's the case. I'm just saying that's a possibility in terms of the timing.
Rami Jara, war journalist and media activist, also joining us this evening from Turkey. Rami, your take on what happened, the gas attack and the very quick response, say some, by the U.S. government to strike that air base in Syria?
Yes, I'm going to try and be representative of Syrians with this. In general, there's a lot of mixed feelings. Mixed feelings, I mean, in terms of every individual. The fact that there is a strike in Syria, and with Syria's history and its citizens' history and insisting on its state having autonomy and being independent, this isn't exactly something that Syrians are proud of. Having said that, with the growing and worrying situation that we have in Syria, I don't even think those words are enough to describe the situation, with over 500,000 people killed. And the fact that this is one of a number of air bases that launch attacks across the country, launch aeroplanes to attack across the country, and have killed so many people. And if this base is disabled, and there are 14 or so planes that have been destroyed, and these planes are being used specifically to attack civilian livelihood, then if you put yourself in the position of one of these civilians and you ask them, are you happy? Even if they respect the sovereignty of their own nation, they will definitely say yes. So this is the problem in Syria. There's no immediate answer in saying that everyone is happy with this or everyone is angry with this. But generally, this is a red line that has been drawn. And a red line that should have been drawn a long time ago. Not just today. This should have happened 3 or 4 years ago. And it didn't happen. And what it's allowed is for a situation to get much worse. And we've said since the very beginning, a lot of people have stressed this, that if you leave a situation like this, you leave a ground for terrorism to grow. You leave a reason to seed terrorism. And it empowers these terrorists. And I think that this helps, let's say, the beginning steps of putting a stop to that.
So Syria, help me understand, Rami. Syria is in the process of surrendering its stockpile of chemical weapons. Why would it blow its own reputation? Why would Assad do something at this point in time?
This is the same question that was asked on the 21st of August 2013. It's the same question that was asked when very peaceful demonstrations were fired at by security forces. It's the same question that was asked when why would peaceful activists, well-known peaceful activists from around the world, be kidnapped by the government and tortured to death? This question is asked again and again. And I think this question, I know that this question is just representative of what people want to know, but such a question comes from a background that doesn't really understand, after even 6 years, why the world doesn't understand that this regime in Syria is a dictatorship that refuses to give in to its own people and does not consider that it is there to serve its own people. The Syrian Arab Army does not consider that it is there to serve its own people. The Syrian Arab Army has done nothing of the sort. So if you look, for example, the Syrian ambassador to the United Nations once, this is about a month and a half ago, held up a picture and basically said this was in Aleppo, and it was a picture of a woman stepping off, coming from Aleppo territory into regime territory, and she was stepping on the back of a soldier, and he said, look at how Syrian soldiers welcome their citizens. That was a picture from Iraq, and it was stolen, and that was exposed. And every single Syrian citizen knew that that was not true. Do you know why? Because Syrians know that there is no such thing. There is the methodology of which the Syrian regime works is not to serve its own people. It's a dictatorship. And why would they attack? The answer is simple. They were testing the international community. They were testing a new administration, just as they did test Obama. And when they did test Obama, and Obama had no follow through to his threats, it empowered the Syrian regime, it empowered the Russians, and for these past 4 years, what we've seen is a monopoly of power over Syria from the Russians, from the Iranians, from Hezbollah, and from Syria.
Rami, why would they test an administration which came out against its own allies to say it is not a priority for us to see Assad go at this point? Our focus is on fighting ISIS, not on removing Assad.
I think if anyone assesses the statements that were made by the Trump administration and the follow-through of statements that were made by the government, and if you follow closely, I think it was obvious that they were starting to take a shifting stance from Russia. If you look at mainstream media and what Fox News has to say and CNN and whatnot, they tend to grab catchy sentences that the president has said and avoid the context of what he has said. I'm not agreeing with President Trump. I'm just saying that it was kind of obvious that they were shifting away from collaborating with the Russians and that they were competitors. I think it was always obvious that when Trump came into power, with the advice of many in the government, he was not going to be able to carry on this relationship for long.
Right. Do stay with us. This U.S. missile strike on the Syrian air base may have also helped the Islamic State launch a major offensive to capture the oil fields near Palmyra. In fact, U.S. missile strike has helped the Islamic State, say some experts report saying that this al-assad base had been providing air support for the Syrian army's operations against the Islamic State east of Palmyra, but the base reportedly suffered heavy damage in the missile strikes and it may no longer be functional. The ISIS has used this opportunity to target Palmyra, including another military base nearby. That is what we are being told. Stephen Golub, until last week, the US was saying that we are not going to focus on removing Assad. It was being called a win for Iran and Russia. What has changed in the last 1 week?
Well, it's not. I agree that the U.S. may be shifting its focus, but if you look at Trump's statement, it's possible that we're not seeing as major a shift as it appears, given the scale of these 59 Tomahawk missiles and the destruction they wrought. That is, he very specifically said, we cannot allow chemical weapons to be used. He did not frame this in terms of stopping the barbarity of the Assad regime in other ways. Maybe there is some more general shift going on, but that's not at all clear. His statement, taking him at his word at this point in this issue, in this incident, was that he was responding to Syria crossing a line regarding the use of chemical weapons. May there be bigger shifts ahead? Quite possibly, but it's not yet clear whether that's the case. And I don't think we should assume that we're going to see a grander strategy on the part of the U.S. to topple Assad, partly because grand strategy doesn't seem to be Donald Trump's thing, and also because it may be that he simply and his administration simply don't want to become more embroiled there beyond a certain level. One thing I'll quickly add is we have to remember when talking about going after ISIS, going after the Assad regime, how tough it is for the international community to deal with this. We saw what happened when another monster was toppled in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and a lot of the destruction we're seeing in Syria now is directly or indirectly linked to that. It's a tough challenge for the entire international community, including even the Trump administration, even given its deficiencies.
Right. Jonathan Landay also joining us, national security correspondent at Thomson Reuters. Jonathan, is America using this chemical attack as an excuse to go out to intensify its aggression in Syria?
I'm not sure the word aggression is apt here. There was an agreement in 2013 for the Assad regime to surrender all of its chemical weapons. The guarantors of that agreement were Russia and the United States. Clearly, Assad has violated that agreement. One of the guarantors of that agreement, the United States, decided to take action because he violated that agreement, when the other guarantor of that agreement basically sat there and allowed this to happen. Let's not forget that the Russians are based in virtually every air base in Syria, including the one in Homs that was hit, Syria. The United States gave the Russians advance warning of the airstrike, and they made it. At this point, it is a limited airstrike that was taken. It does appear to be a very serious message to the Assad regime not to use chemical weapons again. That seems to be the limited message of this. The United States has been senior American officials, Trump administration officials, have been very clear that this was a one-off for now, that they don't expect the regime to use chemical weapons again, and to adhere to the agreement that it agreed to and the Russians guaranteed in 2013. There were other considerations that were taken into effect to limit casualties. If you'll notice, this airstrike took place in the middle of the night when there were very few personnel present at the facility. Right now we're hearing of some limited casualties from the Syrian government.
Right.
And it's one of the other things that's very curious to me is the fact that, there has been this deconfliction line between the United States and Russia to try and prevent accidents from taking place in the air over Syria, where both countries' aircraft operate. The Russians have announced that they've suspended that deconfliction line. They have not canceled it. They have not turned it off. They have merely suspended it. So what this might lead to, possibly, and there's no telling at this point because I heard your last guest correctly say that the Trump administration has no identifiable Syria strategy at all. However, perhaps this airstrike might add new life to the moribund process of finding a political solution to the terrible civil war in Syria.
Right. There's another theory that has been floated, Dr. Awad, that the timing of this strike is very, very significant. While Xi Jinping was dining with Donald Trump, the Americans were bombing an air base in Syria. And the damage has not been as much as it could have been. So it's been called a pro forma strike in that sense. And this, according to some experts, was more a message for China and North Korea than Syria and Russia.
I think there are lots of political messages in this, but I think the timing has nothing to do with the visit of the Chinese because it has been pre-planned earlier. As I said, the attack was not an overnight decision of retaliation for 100% sure. As an expert, you ask any military expert will tell you, we have been embedded with the American in Iraq. We know how much time they took. We know we have been with them in Afghanistan. I know how much time they have taken. It's understood. The military personnel will tell you exactly how long it has been planned on. But I think there is a political message not only for the Syrian, it's for the Iranian, it is for the Russian, it's also to satisfy the Israeli side, because the moment the Syrian government fired at the Israelis' aircraft when they have incursioned into Syria, that was the retaliation from the same airfield. So I think these are the messages now. Maybe it will put more pressure on all the factions in Syria to come across the table and decide the future of Syria for any reconciliation, or maybe a national government, or the 2254 UN Security Council might be implemented in this year as been promised by the whole of the UN Security Council members, which have agreed that this should be 2017. The fact I wanted also to bring here is for us, as in this war, that the United States have got what they want from Iraq. They got the military bases. Russia have already the military bases in Syria for the last 40 years. The problem is that everybody is dividing their own share of the cake of the Syria, because the oil and the gas was discovered in Syria is also shared by 5 countries that are surrounding Syria. So the disintegration of Syria will only serve those who are interested in getting the oil and gas for themselves. So to look at the angle only of a humane part of the story, I think we will not doing justice for the rest of the geopolitics changes in this region, because the Middle East is a very prime interest for the United States, prime interest for the Russian, prime interest for every regional player that wanted their piece of the cake of what's going on the ground.
Okay, Rami Chara, I have to wrap this, but I want to very quickly ask you, where does this leave the fight against ISIS?
Place, there was always an issue with the fight against ISIS depending on planes and attacking from the air. It has always been a recruitment tool that is being used by ISIS, because ISIS are embedded and with civilians, and this is having an effect on the civilians. So I don't think that the international coalition's intervention or the Russian and Syrian procedures in trying to take down ISIS has ever been effective. I think that the amount of people that are being killed, members of ISIS, we're seeing a similar amount of people that are being recruited. I've always believed that there are groups on the ground that are actually from these areas and are willing to fight with ISIS, but do not have the means and the firepower to do so. I'm talking about the same groups that managed to kick ISIS out of 2 major cities, Aleppo and Idlib, within 48 hours. And we're looking at 2 other cities now, and you have fighters from the Kurdish fighters, a number of Kurdish groups. You have the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces. You have the Turks, and you have almost every single country in the sky trying to hit them, and they're not even able to take a few areas. So I genuinely disagree with the procedure that is being taken to take out ISIS. I think that if we are serious about doing it, you require Sunni forces on the ground that can fight and recruit from, instead of having to kill every single one of them, which doesn't make sense. There would be a retreat line for members that fight in ISIS, a way out. And I think that's exactly what you see in any army that's been defeated. There's a moment where half of the army or the majority of the army is able to retreat.
Right. Extremely complex equations there. And as one expert said, it's easy to bomb. It's much more difficult to deal with the consequences. I'm going to thank you all, this panel, for joining us. Rami Jarrah, Dr. WION Awad, Stephen Golub, Jonathan Landay. Thank you for joining us here on Gravitas. We're going to take a very short break. When we come back, we'll talk about a very high-profile visit. The Bangladeshi Prime Minister is in Delhi. We'll talk about what's on the agenda.